Guarded for more than 4 centuries inside the Cathedral of Turin, protected behind a reinforced glass case, it has become the most studied object in human history. A linen cloth that since its appearance has challenged historians, theologians, and scientists. An old fabric of uncertain origin, worn by the relentless passage of time, covered in strange marks, that nevertheless has become one of the most precious relics of Catholicism. An object of veneration for being the only physical evidence of the existence of the man whose legacy has shaped the future of civilization. Inside that glass box, sealed airtight, with no oxygen, and the presence of an inert gas, rests what millions of believers call the Holy Shroud, the burial cloth that covered the body of Jesus Christ, after the crucifixion, bearing upon the fabric an imperishable trace, the face of the Son of God. Since the first recorded mention of its existence in the 14th century, the Shroud of Turin has stood as an enigmatic artifact, a sheet upon which the figure of a man, seemingly imprinted on the fabric, can be recognized. A man whom many have claimed is the Messiah. For centuries, every attempt to uncover its origin led to dead ends. Scientific investigations failed again and again to provide definitive answers, thus strengthening all the accounts that treated this shroud as irrefutable proof of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. For better or worse, that veil of uncertainty seemed to lift in the late 1980s when radiocarbon dating tests confirmed that the shroud dated from more than 12 centuries after the death of Christ. It could not be the burial cloth that covered his body, a finding that vindicated all the skeptics. For more than 30 years, the consensus among academic circles was that the Holy Shroud was nothing more than a clever medieval fraud, a deception crafted over 1,200 years after that crucifixion described in the Gospels. But against all odds, when we thought the case was closed, the myth of the Shroud of Turin blossomed once more, one last time in 2024. The Holy Shroud once again captured. Headlines in media around the world emerged following a controversial article published 2 years earlier in a low-impact scientific journal that had gone unnoticed until the democracy of social media catapulted it to fame. A team of Italian scientists from the Institute of Crystallography in Bari, led by researcher Liberato De Caro, had published a study that reignited the debate over the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. Using an advanced X-ray scattering technique, they analyzed the structure of cellulose in the linen fibers of the shroud to determine its age based on its deterioration. The radiocarbon tests conducted in the 1980s dated the shroud between the 13th and 14th centuries, which had seemed to put an end to all speculation. But the findings of the Italian researchers suggested that the fabric could date back approximately 2,000 years, thus placing it in the time of Jesus Christ, and making it plausible that it was the burial cloth used to cover his body. The scientists themselves admitted in the article that the technique was only reliable if the analyzed fabric had remained in a controlled environment for its entire existence. They were assuming that this shroud, which we know had survived several fires in the chapels where it had been kept, had somehow been preserved in perfect conditions for over 2,000 years. In fact, even assuming that impossible scenario, the X-ray dating method they used had only been corroborated in one other study, coincidentally published in the same journal, and conducted by exactly the same team of scientists who signed that article. Still, 2 years after its publication, the results of the research were spreading indiscriminately across social media and international outlets. The discussion about the authenticity of the Holy Shroud had been fully reopened. The world of faith was clinging to it as validation of what could be the most sacred relic in all of history, the only real image of Christ, and proof of his resurrection. The story of the Holy Shroud emerges from the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. On the eve of his death in what is described as the year 33, Jesus of Nazareth gathered with his disciples at the Last Supper. He shared bread and wine, symbolizing his body and blood, and spoke to them of his imminent sacrifice. He announced that one of them would betray him, leaving the apostles in disbelief. But that very night, Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, betrayed him to the soldiers with a kiss. Arrested and brought before the religious leaders, Jesus was accused of blasphemy and handed over to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who sentenced that king of the Jews to die by crucifixion. Scourged, crowned with thorns, and forced to carry his cross to Mount Golgotha, Jesus faced the crucifixion. The sky darkened, and after hours of agony, he breathed his last. The earth trembled. The Son of God had died a sacrifice that restored peace between the Lord and humanity. After his death, Joseph of Arimathea asked for his body and together with Nicodemus prepared the burial. Jesus was embalmed according to Jewish tradition, anointed with a mixture of myrrh and aloe, and wrapped in linen cloths. His body was placed in a tomb, and a large stone was rolled over the entrance. Roman guards sealed the tomb. Everything seemed to be over. Saturday passed in oppressive silence, but on Sunday, while it was still early morning, a group of women went to the tomb. They wanted to anoint the body. When they arrived, they found the stone rolled away. The tomb was empty. Through the resurrection, Christ had conquered death, fulfilling the promises he had made throughout his life. When the news reached his disciples, Peter and John ran to the tomb. It wasn't completely empty. Something remained: the shroud in which his body had been wrapped. The two apostles took the shroud, the only legacy of the death and resurrection of the Son of God. The Holy Shroud is not mentioned again in the Gospels. Its fate after being removed from the tomb remains a mystery. It doesn't appear again in any document or historical record for more than 1,000 years, until the mid-14th century when a prominent French knight left the first historical trace of the shroud. In 1355, Geoffroy de Charny displayed in a church in Lire, France, a shroud he had acquired during the Crusades in the Holy Land. According to medieval chronicles, the knight made it public as an object of devotion, claiming it was the burial cloth that had covered Christ before and during the resurrection. This was the starting point for the documented history of its existence in Europe, a shroud measuring 4.4 meters long by 1 meter wide, bearing the image of a man who had been tortured, showing both his front and his back. A portrait of the face of Christ imprinted on the cloth. The shroud contained a large number of bloodstains in areas consistent with a crucifixion, even wounds on the head similar to those that might result from a crown of thorns. On the back, signs of having been scourged repeatedly. Such was the belief in its sacred origin that 1 year after its exhibition in 1356, Pope Innocent VI issued a letter recognizing the public veneration of what became known as the Holy Shroud of Lire, giving a significant boost to its spread and establishing it as an object of religious devotion in the Middle Ages. The shroud remained in the Charny family for a century, until in 1453, Geoffroy's granddaughter sold it to the court of the Dukes of Savoy, one of the most powerful families in Europe. In their hands, the shroud was moved to the Château de Chambéry, in present-day France, kept in their royal chapel inside a silver chest. With the Vatican's approval, pilgrimages to the castle became constant, until one night, the shroud came dangerously close to disappearing forever. On the night of December 3, 1532, a devastating fire broke out in the Château de Chambéry. It affected the chapel where the shroud was kept. The fire damaged the silver chest in which it rested, but surprisingly it survived. It wasn't completely burned, but it did suffer serious damage holes caused by the flames and watermarks from the desperate efforts to extinguish them. After the disaster, a congregation of Poor Clare nuns from the city of Chambéry restored the shroud using sewing techniques to cover the holes and damage with a linen backing placed over the original cloth. A rudimentary task that allowed the shroud to be preserved for future generations and unknowingly would ensure that speculation about its origin would never fully end. After the fire, the House of Savoy decided to move the Holy Shroud to Turin to ensure its preservation. Thus, in 1578, the relic was taken to what 4 centuries later remains its resting place, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. The shroud was placed in the royal chapel specifically built to house it, a place protected and out of public reach. No one outside a select group of individuals was allowed to see it for nearly 300 years. It wasn't until 1842 that Pope Gregory XVI authorized the first public exhibition of the Holy Shroud in Turin, an event that stirred great excitement among believers and the curious alike. After a long silence during which the memory and importance of the relic faded over time, Interest in what was already known in Italy as the Shroud of Turin began to grow slowly with each of its rare public showings. Everything was building toward a turning point, the moment when the Holy Shroud would achieve international fame, and the eyes of the entire world would be drawn to the gaze of that lifeless face. For a long time, the existence of the Holy Shroud was known only within certain circles of the Italian Catholic faith. Science and the general public remained largely unaware of the historical relevance of the relic guarded in Turin. But everything changed with the first photograph of the shroud. In 1898, the House of Savoy allowed Secondo Pia, an Italian lawyer and amateur photographer, to take snapshots of the shroud. During the process, he made a long exposure photograph that would show the world the details of that mysterious, sacred relic. But the great discovery came when he developed the photographs and saw that the negative, with colors and tones inverted from reality, was a clearer, more defined image than what could be seen with the naked eye. The features of the face and the body of the man in the shroud became more evident, more defined. An entire reality, invisible to the human eye. It was as if the image on the shroud was the negative, and through that photographic negative, we were now seeing the positive. The wounds and facial features were so detailed it felt like a portrait of the person in the shroud, a visual confirmation of many of the details mentioned in the Bible about the crucifixion of Christ. After the publication of Secondo Pia's photographs, the Shroud of Turin gained rapid worldwide fame. Millions were fascinated by the details imprinted on the cloth, and the debate between scientists and theologians on whether the image it bore was the true portrait of the historical Jesus exploded. In the same way, the skeptics also began to question the very authenticity of the shroud, using Pia's images to argue that it had to be an artistic creation, that what we were seeing on the cloth was paint the result of medieval manipulation. Suddenly, the Holy Shroud had become the most controversial, enigmatic, and fascinating of sacred relics. And this only intensified when in 1931, Giuseppe Enri was granted access to the shroud, and his negatives showed exactly the same results as the first time. Despite widespread doubts for over 30 years about whether Pia had manipulated the photographs, it became clear that he had not lied. The negatives were real. In the years and decades that followed, scientific and theological interest in the shroud grew, reaching its peak in 1973, when the first color television broadcast of the Holy Shroud was aired. Tens of millions of people around the world witnessed in full splendor a relic still veiled in shadows that longed to be lifted. On October 8, 1978, with the approval of the Catholic Church and of the then custodian of the shroud more than 600 years after its appearance, a team of researchers was finally able to carry out the first scientific analysis of the Holy Shroud. The project, named the Shroud of Turin Research Project (STURP), was aimed at analyzing the cloth with the most advanced technology of the time to determine how the image had formed, and above all, whether there was any evidence of forgery. The team, made up of 40 scientists from various disciplines, including physicists, chemists, microbiologists, and forensic analysts, traveled to the Cathedral of Turin, where they were granted 120 hours to study the shroud. No one in history had ever had such access to the relic, and most likely no one ever would again. They captured images in visible light, infrared, and ultraviolet to examine the details of the image, which through a device called VP8, they confirmed, contained three-dimensional information, something that does not occur in conventional paintings or photographs. They performed X-ray radiography to detect chemical elements or artificial pigments on the linen. They studied the properties of the image with spectroscopy and fluorescence analysis methods, examining the fibers of the cloth's thread. They examined the fibers under microscopes to see if they contained any traces of paint. The stains were studied with hematological tests to determine if they were real blood. It was the most exhaustive scientific study ever conducted on a single object. Everyone assumed it would settle all the debates. But in 1981, after 2 years analyzing the data collected when the team published the study's conclusions, the mystery surrounding the shroud was more alive than ever. The findings ignited every speculation. They could confirm that the image was not made with any known paint ink or pigment. They hadn't even found any brush strokes or visible traces under the microscope. It appeared to be formed instead by a dehydration and oxidation of the surface of the fibers, as if the linen had been scorched in a way they couldn't explain without penetrating deep into the cloth. A cloth on which they also found pollen from Gundelia tournefortii, a thorny plant that grows only in the Jerusalem region, and which had previously been linked to the crown of thorns mentioned in the Gospels. The red stains were in fact consistent with human blood type AB, with exceptionally high levels of bilirubin, something that suggested the person wrapped in that shroud had suffered severe trauma, possibly prolonged torture. With ultraviolet light imaging, they were able to detect traces of blood serum that had remained invisible all this time until they stimulated it into fluorescence. Either a medieval artist had predicted the invention of radiation fluorescence techniques 700 years in advance, or that blood was real. With all the technology of the time at their disposal, they found not a single sign of medieval forgery. And they could not explain how the image was formed. The investigation concluded, clearly there is no natural or artificial mechanism known to humankind that can replicate the effect seen on the Shroud of Turin. The team demonstrated that there was no paint on the cloth and that it wasn't an obvious forgery, but they also could not prove it was authentic. Everyone remained in a strange limbo that only generated more interest in the relic. Many critics argued that several members of the team, they held Christian beliefs that may have influenced their approach. The world wanted clear answers, undeniable evidence that would put an end to the debate, and all paths led to the same place determining the age of the shroud. An ambition that would take years to materialize because of the high cost it demanded. Before his death in March of 1983, Humbert II of Savoy, the last king of Italy and rightful owner of the shroud, bequeathed it to the Pope through his will, specifying that the shroud must always remain under the custody of the Supreme Pontiff. From that moment on, the Vatican would be the sole legal guardian of the Holy Shroud. The Pope would decide on its preservation, its public display, and any scientific studies. And against all odds, in a historic decision, John Paul II granted permission to carry out the definitive analysis of the shroud. The Church authorized radiocarbon dating of the cloth in order to determine its true age, giving permission to the researchers to cut a small fragment from the shroud, a piece measuring 7 by 1 centimeters, taken from the damaged lower left corner. The samples were sent to 3 independent laboratories: Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. These institutions would carry out carbon-14 dating on the sample, a method that uses the radioactive isotope of carbon to determine the age of living tissues. All living organisms absorb that unstable radiocarbon, which decays over time as long as they are alive. When they die, the absorption stops, and the carbon-14 begins to break down at a constant rate into nitrogen, a process known as radioactive decay. Knowing that the half-life of the isotope is 730 years, and therefore after that amount of time, half of the radiocarbon in a material would have decayed. By measuring how much remains in a sample, scientists can calculate how much time has passed since the organism stopped absorbing carbon. In other words, when it died. The Holy Shroud was made of linen, a fiber obtained from a plant, a living being. If they measured how much carbon-14 remained in the fabric, they would know when the flax was cut, and therefore the age of that venerated relic. When the radiocarbon dating was performed, the 3 laboratories obtained similar results. With 95% certainty, they could state that the shroud dated from some time between the year 1260 and 1390 AD, a time frame that included the very year Geoffroy de Charny had presented it, after supposedly rescuing it from the Holy Land. The shroud had been crafted in the Middle Ages. It could not have been the burial cloth that covered the body of Christ. The results made headlines in media across the globe. It was a scientific fact. The Shroud of Turin could not be the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth, who had supposedly died 300 years before that fabric was woven. The story seemed to end there. The radiocarbon dating was understandably regarded as the definitive evidence of its falseness. But more than 3 decades later, even if sparked by an article that could not stand on its own, the myth had been reborn. And there were still many questions waiting to be answered. The origin of the shroud may have been resolved through radiocarbon dating, but what no one had ever been able to explain was what truly made the shroud a revered relic: the imprinted image of a man. The face and body of that person remained a mystery. The darkened and discolored regions of the cloth that formed the image exist only on the very top surface of the linen fibers, penetrating no deeper than 0.2 microns. They are not present in the middle or bottom layers of the fabric, something that was already very strange in itself. If that man's body had truly been wrapped in the cloth and left an imprint, the discoloration should have appeared on the underside where the fabric was actually in contact with the corpse. This detail, combined with the radiocarbon dating, strengthened the argument that it was all a fraud, a medieval forgery. The sudden appearance of the shroud in the mid-14th century coincided with a historical moment when sacred relics became surrounded by powerful conflicts of interest. Relics were a source of wealth. People paid money to see them, to touch them, and the wealthy donated large sums for their protection and preservation. Hundreds of churches in Europe displayed artifacts claiming to be connected with Christ. So when de Charny appeared with the shroud in 1355, it was immediately displayed in his church in Lire. It made the site tremendously famous in the region, drawing dozens of pilgrims who wanted to be in contact with the shroud that showed the face of the Messiah. And even then, someone questioned its authenticity. In 1389, Pierre d'Arcy, the Bishop of Laon in France, wrote a letter to Pope Clement VII, denouncing that the Holy Shroud of Lire was a fake. That shroud had not covered the body of Jesus. It was a fraud created by an artist so that de Charny could profit from it. Despite the allegations, the Pope never directly intervened in the matter, nor did he take an official position regarding its authenticity. In fact, he urged d'Arcis to stop talking about the subject under threat of excommunication. According to the bishop, the image on the shroud was not the result of a miracle. It was the work of a painter who had imprinted the image onto the fabric. Radiocarbon 14 dating was reinforcing the idea of a forgery. But there was a fundamental problem with that theory. We know very well the pigments that painters used in the Middle Ages, and as had already been demonstrated by the 1978 project, no trace of any dye or material used in medieval painting was found on the shroud. At a time when fake relics didn't need to be sophisticated, when practically no one questioned what they saw, why would anyone go to the trouble of creating such a complex forgery capable of deceiving science that would only arrive 600 years later? It was clear that the simplest answer, that it was a painting, could not solve the mystery. But if they were going to defend the idea of a forgery, they needed to find a conclusive way to explain how the image ended up there without a single drop of paint touching the shroud. And there seemed to be only one possible explanation: that the image on the Holy Shroud had been created through a primitive photographic process long before the invention of modern photography. The hypothesis proposed that a real body might have been illuminated and projected onto a cloth, in this case, the linen shroud treated with photosensitive substances inside a dark room. Something that in the medieval era was known as a camera obscura. The light reflected by the body would pass through a small hole in the room, projecting its inverted image onto the shroud on the opposite wall, a kind of natural projector. For the image to be imprinted onto the cloth, it would have needed to be coated with a light-sensitive substance, probably silver nitrate. When exposed to reflected light for hours or even days, technically the image would have been printed onto the cloth like a photographic negative, which would explain why, when Secondo Pia developed his photographs, the negative looked like the positive, revealing more detail than the original image. Still, although camera obscura technology existed, there was no evidence that anyone in the Middle Ages knew how to treat cloth with photosensitive substances. There were also no distortions in the image, which would be expected if a three-dimensional body had been projected onto a flat surface. Nor has any other example of this method ever been found in history. Doubts about the hypothesis became decisive when a reanalysis of the chemical data from the 1978 project showed that no trace of silver salts had been found in the linen of the shroud. Without photosensitive substances, it was impossible for a forger to have printed the image onto the shroud. If it wasn't a painting nor a primitive photograph, the theory of forgery began to crumble. If nothing could explain how this fraud was executed, perhaps there had never been a fraud at all. Taking both the radiocarbon dating and the authenticity of the cloth as true, a new theory began to emerge. Perhaps the image on the shroud was indeed evidence of a crucifixion, but not of the figure we thought. Maybe that cloth didn't cover the body of Christ, but that of the last of the Templar masters. In the 14th century, the Order of the Knights Templar, originally created to protect Christian pilgrims on their journeys to the Holy Land, had become a powerful and influential organization, a threat to the Church's authority. Claiming that the Templars were heretics who did not practice the faith properly on October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France, with the approval of Pope Clement V, ordered the dissolution of the order. This led to the arrest of the then Grand Master of the Templars, the Knight Jacques de Molay. The cruelty of the French Inquisition was unleashed on the nobleman. Accused of heresy and blasphemy, he was sentenced to crucifixion, a punishment not intended to kill him. All they wanted was to force him to confess his so-called heretical conduct within the order through torture. After obtaining the confession, the Inquisition had one final humiliation. Planned de Molay was embalmed alive in a shroud and left for 24 hours. After that torment, the nobleman survived, living another 7 years before being executed by fire for recanting his confession. There are accounts that speak of a knight named Jean, who took the shroud used during his master's torture and preserved it as a symbol of the Templar Order's struggle. What's curious is that this Jean was the grandfather of Geoffroy de Charny, who less than 50 years after the torture of de Molay presented the Shroud of Turin to the world. The date 1307 fell within the age range identified by the radiocarbon dating, which dated the cloth's creation between 1260 and 1390. But all of this was based on speculation unsupported by historical records. And even assuming the Templar connection was true, the formation of the image remained unexplained. It was even possible that the entire paradigm of the shroud's age needed to be rewritten. Maybe the result of the radiocarbon dating was wrong. The 1988 analysis had determined that the linen of the shroud dated between 1260 and 1390 AD. But for that dating to be reliable, the sample had to be free from contamination with more recent carbon-14. And here the door to speculation reopened. To date the shroud, the researchers cut a fragment of fabric from a corner that may not have been representative of the original shroud. That edge was visibly damaged, suggesting it may have contained fibers from a medieval restoration after the fire it survived in 1532. When the congregation of nuns repaired the shroud, they introduced new threads from the 16th century, which could have caused the dating to fall somewhere between that era and the 1st century. Moreover, the very fire at Chambéry, it may have played a fundamental role. We know that at high temperatures, fire can alter the carbon balance in an ancient object. If during the fire the shroud absorbed modern carbon, the result of the dating could indicate a date more recent than the actual one, producing misleading results. Even assuming that the analyzed corner was not part of the nun's restoration and was indeed original cloth, there were many reasons why the radiocarbon-14 dating result might not be definitive. But even if that reasonable doubt didn't mean it dated to the time of Christ, when news of this shift in the investigation reached the public, seemingly legitimizing the validity of the controversial X-ray study of 2022 speculation, and fantastic accounts began to flourish again just like decades earlier. Suspicions about the 1980s dating results and the inability to provide a scientific explanation for the image on the shroud led many to see a definitive sign to consecrate the Holy Shroud as the most important relic in all of Christianity. Some believers and theologians proposed that the image was not the result of a natural process, but of a supernatural event occurring at the very moment of the resurrection of Christ, and they claimed partially supported by scientific evidence. In 2011, Italian physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro demonstrated in the lab that certain bursts of ultraviolet laser light can produce superficial images on linen, with characteristics similar to those of the Holy Shroud. However, he also stated that the amount of energy required, equivalent to 14,000 lasers impacting the cloth for 40 nanoseconds, does not occur naturally on Earth, and no technology before the 20th century could have made such a process possible. But some believed that the power of God could have made it possible. According to their hypothesis, the image of the man on the shroud was formed by an intense emission of energy from the body of Christ itself at the very instant he resurrected. An unknown radiation of divine origin, a burst of light that may have imprinted his image on the cloth as if it were a photographic exposure. The same process De Lazzaro proved could create such an image but generated by the power of God. Supporters of this theory believed the Gospels proved that Christ could channel that energy. The Transfiguration of Jesus is an episode described in the Bible where, accompanied by 3 of his disciples on the top of a mountain, his face shines like the sun and his clothes become white as the purest light, revealing to the apostles his most divine nature before the Passion. That phenomenon could have been repeated without witnesses during the most important event in the Christian faith. The image on the Shroud of Turin may have been formed by that light emitted at the resurrection, similar to the luminous transfiguration on the mount, leaving behind an indelible photograph on the cloth, a snapshot of the moment when the Son of God returned to life. Although attractive and fascinating from a religious perspective, the idea that the image was formed by miraculous radiation had no scientific backing. That flash of resurrection had to remain in the respectful realm of faith. But the enigma needed to be resolved once and for all. They were aware that radiocarbon dating was not the definitive proof it had been considered for so many years. We had believed it was at least as far as scientific evidence was concerned. It was just as likely to date from the Middle Ages as from the time of Christ. And without new dating studies, without new permission from the church to damage the shroud, the mystery would endure, though they wouldn't even be able to determine if the image of that man belonged to someone contemporary to Jesus, let alone claim it was him who had been covered by the shroud. All they could do, having ruled out the idea of a forgery, was to find a natural process that could explain the formation of the image. And so they developed the theory that the image on the Holy Shroud may have been formed due to the oils and ointments used to embalm the body of Jesus, or of the man who may have been wrapped in that cloth. Jews would wrap bodies in linen and anoint them with mixtures of oils like myrrh and aloe as described in the Gospels to mask the odor of decomposition. Some studies suggest that those oils could have interacted with sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids, producing an image through direct contact or oxidation of the material, in an effect similar to that of a painting or chemical print on the cloth. The problem is, if the image had formed by contact with the ointments and fluids, the silhouette should be deformed, distorted by the pressure of the linen pressing against the body. But the Holy Shroud shows precise anatomical details and correct proportions, making it difficult to believe it was created by such a mechanism. Furthermore, in experiments attempting to reproduce similar images with oils on ancient fabrics, the same results have never been achieved. It made no sense for the image to be on the upper side of the cloth, and not on the lower side where it would have been in contact with the oils. The type of discoloration in the shroud's linen is not consistent with liquid absorption. And although it's true that the oils may have evaporated in the fire of 1532, no traces of oils, ointments, or perfumes were ever found on the cloth. Too many counterpoints, and with one more theory abandoned, only one hope remained. They could only consider one more natural process that might explain the image on the shroud. A complex theory involving something known as the Maillard reaction, a chemical phenomenon in which sugars and amino acids react with heat, producing browning or darkening on the surface of a material. It's similar to what happens when food browns during cooking, a natural reaction in food, and also in organic tissues under certain conditions, which may have come together in that event that marked the history of the Christian world. What was needed? Sugars, amino acids, and a heat source. They knew that the Holy Shroud had an outer layer of polysaccharides, complex carbohydrates made of many simple sugars due to the presence of starch, a substance traditionally used in the manufacture of linen cloth, which was soaked in a solution from that plant. The sugar factor was accounted for. At the same time, during early decomposition, a body releases ammonia and other nitrogen-based substances through the skin. In the hours following death, more than 30 distinct types of amino acids emanate from the body. The second component was also accounted for. One key ingredient was still missing for the reaction heat. When a corpse begins to decompose, a spike in body temperature occurs. In specific cases, especially in people who died with dehydration involved, that temperature can rise above 40 degrees Celsius. In warm and humid conditions, Christ theoretically suffered severe dehydration due to his time on the cross, and the tomb where he was buried offered both warmth and humidity. So, according to this theory, the amino acids emanating from his body during early decomposition reacted thanks to the elevated temperature with the sugars on the surface of the linen, creating a slight darkening of the shroud, and in doing so forming the image. The Maillard reaction was the only hypothesis that explained the image's superficiality. Remember, the image did not penetrate into the deeper fibers. It existed only on the outermost layer of the cloth, exactly where that layer of plant-based sugars had been applied. It was a natural process, one that did not require supernatural or unexplainable phenomena. A known chemical reaction perfectly documented, and one that would leave no residue, certainly no ink or pigment on the cloth. But again, the theory still could not fully explain the clarity and three-dimensionality of the image. If it had indeed been formed by vapors, the outlines should appear diffuse, not with the precise anatomical detail the shroud displays. It is also unclear whether this process can occur with enough strength to leave a mark on linen that remains visible for over 2,000 years. The Maillard reaction offered a plausible scientific explanation, but it did not fully solve the mystery of the image on the shroud. Everything seemed to point to us returning to the same starting point. For many Christians, the Shroud of Turin is irrefutable proof, the cornerstone of their faith in the death and resurrection of Christ, a relic that captures the miracle of the covenant between God and humanity. For skeptics, it is either an incredibly sophisticated medieval fraud, or the result of a natural process still yet to be deciphered. Scientific evidence speaks of a 14th century work of art, but no one has ever explained the technique used to produce such a fascinating and evocative image. If someone created it, they had to be a genius still defying science 700 years later. Every answer has brought with it new questions. Is it truly the cloth that once covered the body of Jesus, or just an object of devotion forged centuries later? Perhaps the true value of the relic doesn't lie in its authenticity or falseness, but in what it represents to everyone who gazes upon it. A symbol of faith, of mystery, or of controversy that has transcended time. Because beyond its origin and its history, beyond science and belief, that gaze still rests upon us, forcing us to ask what lies hidden beneath that unbreakable veil of shadows.